I'm going to go straight in. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dora knows from our previous relationship as ChargeSafe and Osprey, I'm a big advocate for clear signage on approach to a charging site. And I have seen many varieties of this in practice.
And because it's on the SRN, which is National Highways managed, as opposed to the local authority roads, where it's a little bit more free fall depending on what they want to permit. But on SRN, which is motorways and major A roads, they're incredibly strict about it because of the safety aspect.
So do you want to be sold to by a woman, or do you want to be sold to as a woman? I'm Gary. This is episode 300 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. And on the show today, it's our season-ending roundtable episode. Today's episode, it's a bit of a milestone in that it's both the season-ending roundtable for season 15 and it's episode 300 of the podcast. I'll include a graphic of Gerard Butler from the movie shouting, "This is Sparta!" Now, to be honest, if you told me 7 years back when I started this podcast that A, I'll still be doing it all these years later, and B, I'll be up to 300 episodes, I'd probably have said you were mad. Yet here we are. So thank you to everyone who listens, watches, and supports the podcast. A like, a comment, and a subscribe always helps in these circumstances.
The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence.
This is the regular end of season show, and as usual on these episodes, I invite a number of different people on. Each one presents a topic of interest, which they introduce, open to the panel for a discussion. We all talk about it. When we set the world to rights with that topic, we move on to another topic. So as usual, I'll start by introducing the guests. My first guest is Dora Clarke. Dora is the head of marketing at charge point operator Osprey Charging. Welcome, Dora.
Thank you, Gary.
My second guest is Kate Tyrrell. Kate is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Communication at charger evaluation company EVCI Global, and she was the founder of charger safety organisation ChargeSafe. Welcome, Kate.
I'm an EV Musings repeat offender, by the way.
Yeah, we weren't going to say that, but my final guest is T Swift. No, not that one. Our T Swift has a slightly smaller carbon footprint than that one. I'm talking about Teresa Swift. Teresa's been working in business development in the EV field for several years, and she's currently helping Stark Charge build their business. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you, Gary. Lovely to see you.
So now we know who everyone is. Let's get down to the business in hand. I want to pass the podcast over to my first guest, Dora, to introduce their topic. Over to you, Dora.
Thank you, Gary. So I want to talk today about EV road signage. And I think EV drivers like yourselves are probably aware that there is a bit of a lack of signage on our roads for EV charging. And this is due to different factors. For example, different roads have different rules around which signs can go up and who those need to be approved by. And as you can imagine, motorways and the A road, the very big A roads, require quite stringent rules to make sure that our roads are safe and that there's not too many signs on them. And then there's also local roads, and those ones, those signs are approved by local authorities, and different local authorities follow slightly different rules. So the problem is at the moment that there's a set of regulations. It has a symbol for EV charging. It has a couple of different types of wording that we might have for EV charging, but it's very limited. It's quite strict about what can be approved. And so what we know government doing at the moment are having a review of that. And they're looking at, can there be better signage? And can we, I guess, given the total sort of transformation, the switch to electric vehicles, we need to have signs that provide safety for drivers, provide information for drivers. We need an overhaul of the signs. And I guess my interesting conversation that I'd love to have with you guys today is what should be on the signs? What do drivers need? What do they look for? What is going to give them the information that they're looking for at that moment in time on those different types of roads? Perhaps it's different types of EV charging, different speeds, different numbers of charging. And so I guess there's lots of different elements that come into it. But from the driver perspective, what do we think needs to happen? What would be the best outcome?
I'm going to go straight in. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dora knows from our previous relationship as ChargeSafe and Osprey, I'm a big advocate for clear signage on approach to a charging site. And I have seen many varieties of this in practice. And Osprey, I have to say, are probably one of the best CPOs for it, because there will be smaller signs that simply say, Osprey EV charging this way on the approach, which I think is relevant. It's not too clunky. It's not too much information. It's what you need. And then as you're entering the charge site, there's a totem or something nearby that will state the kilowatt hour that's available, the speed of the charging, the price per kilowatt hour. And I don't know how easy it is to change that based on the different tariff, the rate, the time of day that you're charging, because of course those energy prices will change. So that's, I guess, kind of a slightly separate tangent from the overall conversation. But for me, it's interesting to hear how those conversations have moved with the different local authorities across the country, in that which ones have been, you don't have to name and shame, of course, but which one, Gary wants you to, absolutely, but which ones have been, the most proactive in saying, yes, absolutely, this is really positive information for drivers to have. And it works in two ways. It works for the drivers to have clarity of, oh, there's a charger there, I can go and use that, if they're not using an application to map them to one. And it gives visibility to our lovely internal combustion engine drivers, and kind of creates that confidence of, oh, every time I'm driving down this road, I can see this sign on the left here, there's a sign up here on the right, which is for another provider. And it just builds this big visual impact that the charging infrastructure is here where they may not necessarily see it. And I've actually found myself recently driving around, and every time I see a charger, I will point it out to whoever is in the vehicle with me. I'm like, oh, look, there's another charger. And I'm doing it because I'm a nerd, but I feel like it's actually helping them see it, because if you don't need a charger, you don't necessarily see them. But the signage is going to stop that from happening for us and say, there's chargers here, come and use it.
Yeah, I think local roads is a really interesting one, talking about local authorities a little bit more, because they do broadly adopt that kind of wider, it's called something very long, the traffic signs regulations and general directions rules, which are what applies to the major roads. And they do kind of adopt it, but like you say, they do have a bit more flexibility in terms of what they can authorize. The interesting problem is they actually have to, if they want to really go hard in on getting a lot of good EV road signs, and this is non-branded we're talking about as well, so those really great informational ones that you're talking about where you'd love to be able to point them out to drivers. At the moment, they have to actually apply for DFT, or Department of Transport, Secretary of State sign-off to authorize or permit those. And I think that's a real barrier. I do feel more of them would be keen to do so. It's a bit of a hurdle at the moment. A couple of councils that have a area-wide permission to approve EV signage, which is obviously brilliant, but more of that would be great, because then you get that confidence, you get that visibility of the charging sites everywhere on those local roads.
Yeah, I think I used to work for Formula Space, so I know Osprey Signage very, very well, and is one of the best CPOs, as Kate Rowley says, regarding signage. I think part of the issue really is when you're actually driving down the road and you can't find it. It's on ZapMap, it's on Electroverse, you've got the brown signage, but then I suppose in some respects the local councils, there is so much street furniture and so many signs, they're like, well, hang on, which do we approve, which do we not approve? But I think the main thing is, if it is on Octopus, Electroverse and ZapMap and the other apps, it's when you actually get on site. So you drive onto a site and it's a big car park and you're like, well, hang on, where are they? They're there. And because it's private land predominantly, you can actually put, I think it's a certain size sign that doesn't get involved, or you don't then need to worry about planning. And if it's not permanent either. I don't know if the regulations have changed on that, but it then gives that initial until people realise that actually there is charging there. And then you get there is charging here. And then you can get the banners and things like that. So it is a difficult one, but I think the main one is when you land on site. I mean, even when you are arriving at service stations, it says that the CPOs are there, but you've still got to look for it. And the chargers are lit, which then goes in with the ChargeSafe option to make sure that you've got that lighting so that people can see, not just from a safety point of view, but so they can see the chargers as well. So it is key, and it's key to people realising that the infrastructure is there and it is growing all the time and they're popping up all the time.
Can I ask a stupid question? Because I genuinely don't know the answer to this. I feel like in smaller on private land situations and on the approach, that the cost of putting up a sign would belong to the network operator or the person the business installing the infrastructure, right? But do service stations pay for their approach signs, and do theme parks pay to have, the brown signage around the UK? There are so many different styles of road signs, some which are completely mandatory and are required, some that could be seen as,
Rogue?
what's the word? Like, why are they there? Optional could be, an option. So why is this not considered essential infrastructure? Because it is infrastructure. And who is paying for it?
I think that's exactly
ones.
why.
Yeah, brown ones you have to apply for if you're a hotel or and you then have to pay for it as well for it to go up. It's
Okay.
free. So yeah.
Yeah, so the interesting example is the EV Hub sign, which is a new EV specific sign for the A roads, for major A roads, that was given the green light last year. And that requires, as a CPO, us to apply for it. We would pay for it all ourselves. And because it's on the SRN, which is National Highways managed, as opposed to the local authority road, where it's a little bit more free fall depending on what they want to permit. But on SRN, which is motorways and major A roads, they're incredibly strict about it because of the safety aspects. And so, yes, everything is paid for yourself. And it is quite a process. It's things like all sorts of surveys, topography, like will you add extra weight to the existing signs such that it topples over? And you can understand why that's the case, but it is incredibly frustrating when you just want to say there's an amazing hub of 16 chargers at the next services, or not even at the services, there's a purpose-built hub that we've spent, upwards of £1 million building, and yet just getting a sign. However many tens of thousands. So I think that's the bit that's still kind of in development, and I'd love to see more just a bit of a structure, a bit of rules, and then it means that all of us can kind of have confidence, but also expectation setting. Like, if you see this sign, it means this. And I'd be interested to know if you guys think there's a threshold, like what size, speed, number of chargers do you feel is enough to get yourselves a roadside sign as drivers?
I think for me personally, I used to live locally to the Primrose Vale farm shop, right? And there was 4 or 6 there. And that has a little bit of signage just coming off of the roundabout and then leading into the farm shop. And I would not have known that those Osprey chargers were there if I hadn't have seen the sign. And I was like, oh, and I went in and I was like, amazing, they're the Kempower ones, that's even better. So I think anything that's 4+ should have a sign, because you've got a higher chance of being able to plug in and get charged without having to queue and stuff, which is better. And from an investment perspective, from a CPO's eyes, if you're paying that much to put in the 4 chargers, you want to make sure they're going to get a high utilisation. If it's just a lone charger on its own, having that available on a mapping application is great. Locals will probably be aware of it, but where you're putting in 4+ chargers, it really does need a good sign to demonstrate that.
Yeah, and it'll also show local areas and also people who are thinking of going EV that the infrastructure is there. Whereas at the moment, if they don't see signs, they'll still listen to those people that are saying the infrastructure's not there, there's not enough chargers. But that's because they're not necessarily being promoted or people can't see them. I think if the more people see them, the more confident they'll get.
Go on, Gary. I know you're itching to do it. Yes.
Well, I think it's been great listening to you talk about this. I think, to my mind, I think we need to separate the types of signage. So let's give an example, and I'm not going to be partisan here. In fact, I'm going to be the opposite of that. I'm not far from the Winchester Super Hub that InstaVolt have run. I go there quite regularly. It's a nice site. A little bit overpriced sometimes, but we'll bypass that. When you go down the A34, which is part of the strategic road network, there is no signage there that tells you that it's there. InstaVolt have had to actually put up a banner sign in a field next to the A34 to say, get off at the next junction. When you get off at the junction, there's a couple of roundabouts that you have to negotiate. And I think there might be one sign attached to one tree at one point telling you get off the roundabout at this point. Totally insufficient for the size of the net charger that's there or the site that's there. But it does bring up an issue of, and you've already talked about it, we need to be able to identify at the strategic road network level, there is a charger or a site at the next exit. Then when you get off, you need to be able to say, this is the way to that site from this exit. But also, and I think this comes back to motorway service areas, if I'm going up the M1, every time I go past a sign that said motorway services, it tells me generally the price of petrol there, although That's sort of been reduced more or less over the years. But it also tells me the additional facilities that are there. Is this a Starbucks site? Is this a coffee site, a Costa site? Is this a BP site? Is it a Shell site? And I think we need something there. So if I'm going to an Osprey site and there is coffee there, is it Costa? Is it Starbucks? Are you at a KFC site? Is it a Marston's pub? And I think there's that kind of signage that also needs to be considered when we're looking at the whole area of what to include on the signs and where they should be put.
I feel like I've been an absolute snob about the coffee thing as well, Gary, because we'll see motorway services and it'll be like 15 miles and then 40 miles. So if the one coming up in 15 miles is a certain coffee chain, I won't use it. I will drive an extra 25 miles because I really want a very specific coffee from an alternative coffee chain. So for me, that information absolutely is important. And I really like your point about the Winchester Services Hub, because the first time I went to visit it, I had to put it into my sat nav, and on the blind hopes that I was going to make it. I didn't know exactly where it was. And it's just worth noting, I guess, for all the listeners who haven't had the pleasure of attending the site yet, because it is a really wonderful site, and they do have the exact specific coffee that I'm always looking for. It's the turning to get onto the road where you come off to go into the service station is like the fifth exit on the roundabout. And I almost always slightly miss it when I'm doing it. So it's worth mentioning, if you're going and you think that you need to come off at the fourth, don't, it's the next one, which has been signposted since. But on my first visit, it wasn't there. Yeah, just a little help, really.
There's also an additional thing on that, and this comes back to the last time I saw you in person, Dora, was at the opening of the Evesham hub, I think.
The services on the EVCI.
That's the one.
Did you struggle to leave? Because I couldn't leave.
That's what we want.
I couldn't
Well, what I
leave.
was going to say is the problem is you come off the main roundabout there and it says EV charging, which is fine. But the very first sign that you see for EV charging is not for Osprey, it's for one of your competitors.
No.
Now,
Yes.
A, that's a problem for you,
Ours is
but
coming.
B, the other sort of related issue to this is we are getting more and more sites where CPOs are co-located. And the prime example I always think of is, I think it's Gretna Green, or the services up around there. I think there are either 3 or 4 CPOs co-located there. So there has to be some way of identifying, yes, there are chargers. These are potentially the CPOs that are there. And if you want Tesla and What's It, you've got to go this way. If you want GridServe, you've got to go that way. If you want Ionity, you've got to go that way. And I think that's also a level of signage that we need.
That's a beautiful segue into something I want to discuss. But firstly, what I'll just touch on there is this is going to come down to how charge point network operators differentiate themselves from their competition. You've already mentioned price per kilowatt hour. There is a CPO that very quietly increased their prices, much to their disappointment. I'm sure everybody noticed. And for that reason, I think Osprey will stand out. It's a much larger site at the site that we both visited that I struggled to leave because there was no exit this way sign. I made it to the chargers absolutely fine. And in fact, I parked across 2 bays because I'm an entitled, what do you call it?
Yeah, no,
She go.
good space. I do think with the multiple charging networks in the same place, there's actually a bit of a hub advantage in a way. Whilst it seems like fierce competition, I think in time, having co-location is not the worst thing in the world because it increases the availability. So it increases the reassurance for drivers that there will be a charger there. And I do think if you're national highways, for example, looking at that site, that services, you're not actually looking at individual networks. You're just saying, okay, in total, there are 40, 50 rapid charge points. Therefore, this merits a non-branded EV hub sign on them. It's the motorway, the main A road. And that's really powerful. And we would obviously definitely want that, even if it's mutual benefit, isn't it? And it's going to be unbranded on those roads. But at this point, we can't even get that. So hopefully that to come.
Do we have anything else we want to say on this? Because I'm conscious we're running a little bit behind schedule at the moment. Any final thoughts before we move on? I shall take the silence as agreement and say thank you for that, Dora. I think it's one of those topics that we're going to come back to. I can guarantee as things move forward and the regulations crystallise, I think we're definitely going to come back to that. So thank you for that. Kate, over to you now, please.
Hello, everybody. So for my topic, I really want to touch on the driver experience. And as we've just briefly touched on, what is going to make a driver turn left and right if they enter a site and there are several operators that are all there at the same time. I think there's also a misperception out there in our industry, but also the wider general public, that CPOs are making money hand over fist. And I guess my question to you guys is, are CPOs putting profit over people versus, when we think about people, I'm talking about the driver experience, I'm talking about the speed of the charge, the reliability of the charge, the safety and accessibility of that user experience, and now recently with my EVCI hat on, the accuracy of the charge. So the price, are you getting every kilowatt hour that you pay for? What's your experience been?
I can go first.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting element of the charging experience that EVCI is analysing at the moment. And I think it's almost, it feels like a good sign of a maturing industry in that there's elements of site design, accessibility, safety, the kind of the power and speed of the charge points that over the years have been developed and improved. And people like yourselves, Kate, have really held the industry to account to ensure that all new sites are up to a standard that really benefits the driver and differentiates us. It's absolutely in our interests to do it. I think coming to that point about the overall sort of underperformance of then the power delivery is kind of that next step. And I'd love to hear a bit more, because I think it would be useful to talk about the analogy with petrol stations, because I think they already have a calibration, don't they?
They do.
Maybe going into that, can it sort of, because that was, I think for me, what really made it clear as to what we're analyzing, like what is being tested.
Absolutely. So we would call it the wet fuel market. So in the wet fuel market, they are subject to inspections, metrology inspections, to ensure that the accuracy of the fuel price per litre is, on the nose. I think there's like a 0.5% margin for error within that. And if a single pump on a forecourt fails that accuracy test, they'll shut the whole thing down until it's been recalibrated. In terms of the losses to the likes of BP and Shell, that would be catastrophic to shut down an entire forecourt for the day. And whilst we're not 100% there yet as the electric vehicle industry, it's important that we start to hold ourselves to this standard, because this mandatory requirement is coming. It's going to be here. So how do we ensure that the margin for error in delivering kilowatts per pound is accurate, and that people aren't paying more for less? Does that help, Dora?
Yeah, no, I think that's really useful, and I think it's great to have another industry that's got a similar setup, and to then as operators, as networks, but also I think as hardware manufacturers as well, start to build in, that this is coming in a more regulatory form. Then that's a great thing, because it just means it builds it right through the whole supply chain and I guess the maintenance processes as well, to make sure that that those charges are all within the bounds. I guess I don't know if this is getting too technical, but what sorts of things might need to be fixed in your experience?
Ooh.
So too technical.
I'm strategic partnerships and comms, Dora. I'm not an engineer, but yes, you're absolutely right. So we are actually actively working with the OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, for anyone who doesn't know what that means, to understand how accurate the hardware is that's coming off of the production line. So it's really important to nurture these relationships at every single level, because I don't know if you guys are aware, there was a recent law that was passed over in Paris, which I just think is phenomenal, where products have been built historically to only last a certain amount of time. So it could be, 3 years for your mobile phone or whatever, and they're naturally set to deplete over time, or to just die a horrible death. Give you the Xbox Ring of Death or something that happens with that one. And much the same, it's holding the hardware manufacturers accountable for the quality of their product, and to know that if you as an operator are going to go and spend millions of pounds on hardware that you want to spread out all over the UK, and you're really putting your trust in this one. I mean, I know you wouldn't put all your eggs in one basket, but if you were going to go with one launch partner who is a hardware manufacturer, you would want to know that they're delivering that accuracy off of the line. But then it does change when it goes into the ground. It's kind of that double. It's Californian standard is 1% off of the line, and they give that little bit of leeway to 2% once it's in the ground, because of things like environment and the power supply can have that very subtle difference, and that's something that we factor in as well. I mean, it's hugely technical, and I'm happy to share some information with you at some point, but it's a little bit above my pay grade, I think, actually.
But it's interesting to know, did you say California has brought this in?
Yes, so they're working to it now.
Nice.
For me, I think it's making sure about the infrastructure itself being maintained there, and the longer the charger is in the ground, does it lose a certain amount of its accuracy? And with the new chargers that are coming online, with the new manufacturing, that should then create a stability, hopefully. Kate kindly came to Stark Charge offices, and ours was a pass, which is fantastic news. So we were really pleased with that. I was panicking for a minute. And especially where you're looking at the customer needs to know. They haven't even, going back, they probably haven't even thought about it. And, you know, from a wet fuel point of view, there is that fair price or whatever, and people know about it. But it's making sure that we're doing it before the customer realizes, because it just gives them another excuse to say, I'm not going to, transition to an electric vehicle.
That's exactly
They can't even deliver. I'm paying 89p per kilowatt hour when in actual fact, I'm only getting 50%.
I think the last thing any of us want is to give the naysayers any further reason to put out posts on social media, or for the Daily Fail to print more dump.
Daily Fail.
So for us, we're very much an extra arm, a tool of support in a toolbox of the CPOs to say, we're on your side, we want to help you. But for me, as you know, passionate about the driver experience. I want to make sure the drivers are taken care of, that they're well lit, that they're seen, that they can find the chargers. The signage, as Dora mentioned earlier, that's really important to me. The accessibility for the disabled community, being able to charge just the same as everyone else can. Women who've got to get buggies out of their boot and maneuver a toddler out of a baby seat have got that little bit of extra wiggle room to do so. It all combines. So that does increase the output of site delivery. I know that we've previously touched on this very, very gently ahead of the podcast, where we talked about profit. Is it profit over the customer experience? And there is this misperception, again, where I said, CPOs are making hand over fist. Would you mind just expanding a little bit on that? Because I think it needs to be addressed. It feels like it's the elephant in the room. And I would like to understand a little bit more about, how long is it going to be until CPOs are truly profitable?
I think there's two sort of elements, without trying to get too financial, about the way CPO businesses are working. And one of them is capital expenditure, so investment in building sites. And the funding that most networks have, either debt or equity funding, goes into building sites. So very, very expensive, whether it's the hardware, the civils, the grid connection. Those sites are hundreds of thousands of pounds, especially the larger hubs. So it's a capital intensive business, as most infrastructure is. And what we're talking about when it comes to the sort of profitability idea, and where we and others will be setting our tariffs in order to make money back. You might think we are trying to pay back, obviously, that investment. But actually, before we start paying back that investment, we have to cover our costs. And that's the operating costs of running the network. And so that covers things like, it covers the cost of the energy that's provided to the customer that we have bought and sell on to the driver. But it also covers the grid charges. So you probably heard these talked about their standing and capacity charges. They are fixed network charges. They're a favorite of Osprey's to talk about because they're incredibly high. If you have a large connection, you run a big charging hub, you actually pay tens of thousands of pounds per site per year just to have that connection. And those have been going up in recent years. And funnily enough, as those go up, you'll have seen the public charging prices of many networks and our peers go up as well. And that's not a coincidence. So there's those sorts of charges. So it's all the energy stuff. And then there's also things like, covering all the operating costs of the business. So the call center, the maintenance, which, as we've just talked about, is incredibly important, the cleaning, the site, whether it's sort of landscaping or other types of maintenance, and the overheads of having staff and an office. So the idea, the profitability that maybe you were talking about is, are we absolutely raking in the revenue, covering all those costs, and then making profit on top of that? And the answer to that is no. And the reason I can say that here openly to everyone on the podcast is because we will publish public accounts, and you can look at all the CPOs who publish those public accounts, and they're all posting losses, certainly up to the most recent financial year. And the reason for that is partially those grid costs are high, and partially because of that high sort of capital expenditure investment into the sites. Now, we are at a very, very early stage of the market, so that is forecast to change, and hopefully will be the next few years. And if there's certain things like some of those costs, which we're working to try and kind of either keep the same or reduce even, especially some of those grid and electricity costs, which are forecast to continue to go up. So if we can keep those at a level or even find some way of bringing them down, then that could then translate into the prices coming down for customers. Ideally, at some point we would make, and all of us as a sector would love to see that sort of operational profit grow, simply because it's good growth. It's good for the UK to have a sector that's new, high potential, really kind of growing over time. Back to your original point of profiteering, I guess the impression that the rising tariffs have had over time is that maybe CPOs are taking this a bit. They're like, oh, we'll just keep pushing it up. No one seems to care. There's not enough infrastructure. People will still use it. And that's, I can only speak for Osprey. That's absolutely not the case. And it's really the fixed network charges that have been rising. And over the past 3 or 4 years, it's been over 400% or more in some cases. That's the kind of, hopefully, in a nutshell situation. One thing I would say is that obviously we could cut some costs. Maybe it's something like maintenance and improve stack, but do it right. We don't want to do that. And that's exactly stuff like that. We just we have to do it. We have to have at least, and as Osprey, we hold ourselves to a minimum standard of driver experience, and that's non-negotiable. And at the moment, we have to, that has to stay in the cost stack. So yes, it's a balancing act at the moment, but I think the future is definitely looking bright. But as you say, it's always got to be customer first. It's always got to be user experience first, and we can never sacrifice that for the financials. Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. I can see Gary's absolutely chomping at the bit to get involved. He's wriggling around in his seat. He's like, please let me go. But one thing I do just want to add on to the end of that, and thank you, Dora, for explaining that. I really appreciate it, is that this industry has mostly been funded privately. It's not been given huge government handouts. It's, it is something that requires a boardroom and investors and presentations and being able to demonstrate we're going to be profitable in XYZ years, and those prices, will even out as the initial install has been taken care of, as drivers increase in numbers and the utilisation figures rise. So that is understandable. I think it's more of a case of, if you can absorb the risk of bigger spends at this point in time by taking care of the driver experience and doing things like that maintenance that you're talking about, for me, that shouldn't even be optional. And I know it's not for Osprey, but it is critical infrastructure. It needs to be, on the nose every time. It needs to be working. It needs to be safe and accessible, and it should be exactly what you're paying for. It's that simple. And yet there are still operators who are getting it wrong. But I do empathise that it has largely been privately funded, and it's come up against barrier after barrier. Sorry, Gary, I'm literally just taking your podcast away from you now. Teresa, would you like to?
It only needs to be 5% VAT. So that's the other one. Reduce the VAT, then all customers will be happy.
If I might play devil's advocate here, how can I put this? One of the things that I know, Kate, if you had your ChargeSafe hat on, would be pushing for, and I've been pushing for a lot with particularly hubs, is Canopies. Now, if we split the charge point operators who are out there sort of down the middle, there are a number who will always put Canopies in at every site. MFG, Fastned, for example. There are those who will put Canopies in at some sites, and there are those who won't put Canopies in. Now, I understand that there are a number of reasons why this could happen, but if I was playing devil's advocate, I would say those that aren't putting Canopies in are doing it because they want to decrease their costs, i.e. increase their potential profit at the expense of the customer. How would you address that statement?
It is a very good question. Well, a good statement. I think there's a few things going on. I can't speak for MFG because they're a huge network, Fastnet are very selective, and they will only build where they can get the permission for a canopy. So one of the barriers, as I know you know, is that there's things like planning permission and other kind of reasons and restrictions why canopies might not work. But your point is really about cost. And I think, without being too blunt about it, there is, at the moment, because of those other and growing costs that are putting pressure on a site and the site's ability to perform straight away, putting a canopy on day one sets you back to not even making profit, to breaking even on that site. This moment in time, it's a case-by-case basis. I was always subject to those other things. It's a retail, we operate quite a lot in retail car parks. Never in your life are they going to give you a permission for a canopy. But places like Twyford, where you visited recently, it's an existing service station. You're looking at upwards of £15,000 per bay to put in a canopy of the sort of caliber that we as a brand, as a brand in the physical space would like to do. And it's just a question at this point in time. It doesn't stack up for us economically. And it's not, and you say that's because we are trying to get to potential profit break even. Absolutely we are. And they're very expensive. I guess it's not saying that we would never do it. And we do have this conversation a lot about canopies. There's a huge kind of debate backwards and forwards. Does it, is the upside of it worth the cost? We spend a lot on other stuff that's quite expensive but enhances the customer experience. Yeah, I think it's an ongoing debate that I'm not sure I can answer in one way, but that's the sort of stuff that's going on. Does that help?
Can I ask another
that's
stupid
interesting,
question? I love them. When it comes to planning permission, do you have to make a payment per application? And if that is or is not the case, are you able to make planning permissions across your entire network and then look at retrofitting in future once you're back in the black? You're able to expand the network and jazz up your sites a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it would be a great route. And certainly, you do have to pay to put in the permission or the application, in the first place. But yes, that sort of thing. And I think more and more networks we've been in a period of very high growth and a lot of networks have been build. And now many of us are saying, okay, we've got this pretty decent size estate now. There are sites we're proud of. There are sites we should improve. There are sites that maybe we need to go back and revisit. And we've been expanding a lot of sites. So where we might have had 1 or 2 sort of 50 kilowatt chargers, we're replacing those with higher power and more chargers, which is a great sign of the demand in those places. And obviously that's the first step, improving the speed that people can get and the number of chargers that people have access to is the first step. And then I think you're right. The next step is then, okay, where can we then improve that built environment around the charger? It is a bit of a battle it's not just planning and councils, but also landlords. So because we partner with private landlords for leases on most of those sites, it's a conversation with them, and you'd be surprised at how difficult it is sometimes just to get up a branded sign that says Osprey in the charge in the car park. It's a battle, but you're right. Yeah, that'd be a great thing to do.
Does anyone think that the charge points would be used more often or be more popular if they did have those canopies, like wet fuel stations where, because you are stood there for sometimes a little bit longer than you are, to actually charge the car and get it all plugged in? Would people use it more than...
We do ask people relatively regularly, and I know ZapMap and people do sort of surveys about these things. Obviously, if you could snap your fingers and you could have a canopy, of course, I think people would always prefer it, but it comes quite low down the list versus other things that they want. Yeah, I think
I thought that was it.
Yeah, but no, absolutely, it's definitely always on the list. Perhaps just deprioritized versus other elements.
Hair usually.
I think it's a nice point though as well, T, because it's that familiarity, isn't it? It's when we're looking at mass scalability of the market, there's a lot of drivers out there who are not yet in an electric vehicle, who don't really understand the experience of using a charger for the first time. If they see a forecourt much similar to that have been delivering, it feels like that petrol experience. You can pop inside, you can use the facilities, you can grab a coffee, get a newspaper, whatever. And I think that those will become more popular in future. Yeah, I feel like that's how we're going to get into the wet market expansion.
There you go, Gary.
Once again, time is creeping. So unless we've got anything else on that, I would like to say thank you, Kate, for that topic and move on to Teresa.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. Hi, everybody. So leading into the customer experience and myself just mentioning ladies actually our hair and things like that. I'm just wondering, at the moment, when we purchase an electric vehicle, the locations where we get them, so the dealerships, we are predominantly dealing with gentlemen and gentlemen selling us our vehicles. Females are 49% of the collective having a driving license. My thought would be, how do we try and work in getting more ladies selling vehicles, especially electric vehicles, to the 49 collective, and then also providing that customer trust? Because we're just so used to being sold a vehicle by a gentleman. Would we be more likely to buy a car from somebody that we trusted more, such as ladies? So for me, it's definitely looking at that customer service right from the beginning. So, we can have the signage, we can have the accessibility, we can have the bays slightly wider because we've got to get push chairs out and things like that, and that isn't necessarily taken into consideration. The EV vehicles are also a lot bigger as well, so the spaces do need to be bigger. So yeah, for me, I would just love to see more females selling us 49% our EV vehicles in the future. What's everyone's thoughts?
I love it. I love it. I want to see it. I want to experience it. I had I recently started filming an EV review series for the Women Drive Electric team.
Yes.
And I got to, the very first one that we had was a Volvo from Wayland's over in Gloucester. And it was really cool. And I went and picked up the Volvo, and this lovely lady came out. She must have been in her early 20s. She was fanatic about electric vehicles. She was telling me all about all the different EVs that Volvo had produced. There was nothing this woman did not know about this car. She was telling me about all of the safety features on it, the in-car tech, the specs of the external. And I was like, don't worry about that. I don't care about that. I need to know if you can get buggies and dogs and stuff in this car. So please don't worry about too much about the detail. But she was armed and loaded with all of that information. And I absolutely would have bought a vehicle from her if I had the money. I don't. But I feel like the way that she took herself very seriously, she carried herself extremely professionally. She wasn't hard selling. She didn't need to. I was there to pick up a car that I was going to borrow for a few days and do a review on. And it felt authentic. It didn't feel like, I just need to flog 10 cars by the end of this week. I need to meet my quota and I'd like to get you out of the door as quickly as possible with a new pair of keys in your hand and possibly a finance agreement so I can make even more money on top of that. I do not enjoy that experience. I hate the experience of buying a car. But if I was talking to a dealership and she was there, I think it would be a very different response.
Yeah, I mean, just a little statistic to throw, there is only 20% of the automotive industry are actually females. So yes, from a dealership point of view, but also from the higher levels as well. I mean, within the EV industry and the infrastructure, I do think there are more ladies, which is fantastic. So I think that is going in the right direction. And I wouldn't want to take anything away from gentlemen. They're very good at selling cars. They're very good at what they do. And there are so many male advocates out there. But it would just be nice to have more of that, that female input. What were your thoughts, Dora? Sorry, I have a habit of babbling sometimes, as these two know really, really well.
I'd be interested. I think we should expand this, not just for dealerships, but beyond that as well.
Yeah.
I think it's, depending on whether maybe you lease or you buy through, I don't know, secondhand through a third-party website, or you are buying direct from a dealership. All of those interactions, not just in person, but on the phone or the person who drops it off, or the sort of advice that you get maybe tend to be male as well. So I think it isn't just that in-person experience, it's the sort of full end-to-end feeling of interacting only with someone maybe who you don't feel as related to in that way. So yeah, I guess I don't really have an answer or a solution, but maybe it's people like Auto Trader, for example, as well, looking at how they're selling. I know that there's really really interesting and great analysis that's done on whether it's like job adverts or websites, or the way that people browse and read things and interpret things can be different depending on your gender. So we're trying to make the way that things are sold and the elements of those things that are emphasized more gender neutral is a good place to start. And again, having the opportunity to, when you are, if it's a lease, for example, talking on the phone to, or almost like having a choice of salespeople. Who do you want to talk to about this, your lease with us? Something like that could even just be a good start. Because I imagine there's probably women out there who aren't fussed, don't mind. Maybe it's not impacting them and they don't mind. But then some of us who would love to have a bit more of a bit more tailored, or like you say, a sort of more relatable experience when we do that.
I have many, many thoughts on this. I'm really sorry. I have so many thoughts on this. Exactly that, Dora. The delivery partner that's used to drop off the vehicles, because I have had many subscriptions or leasing or company cars that have been handed over. I literally took delivery of a Changan yesterday. So excited. For a week. It's just a week. It's not my car. And the bloke who pulled up with his massive lorry and wheeled it off the back just couldn't shut up about his V12 engine. And I was like, yeah, cool. So and I feel like every time I take delivery of a car now, I have to educate the person, because they drop off the car and they're like, oh, what'd you think about this then? They're kicking the tires on it. And I'm like, must I always be working?
Yes.
And then with my family, when they're like, women shop differently, and I would love to see the dealership experience change, the third party subscription channels change, the used vehicles, because I like to go into a shop. I hate online shopping, but that is my personal preference, and other people might feel differently. I want to go in, I want to touch things, I want to feel things, I want to sit in the car, I want to open the doors, I want to know how quietly things shut, especially if I'm having to get my niece out of the car and she's sleeping. Is it going to slam shut? Is it going to shut quietly? How loud can I get my music for those days where I'm roaring up the M1 and I just want to, chill out to my favourite podcast, Gary, or bang out some tunes? It's such a personal thing, buying a car. I do not want somebody to come over and be condescending or patronising, or even ask me, where's your husband? Don't have one.
If 9 times out of 10, right, if there is a male or a female, I don't know where the statistics are, but mostly, right, you'll go into a dealership, right, the wife and the girlfriend or whatever, the male and the female are there. 9 times out of 10, it will be the female that says yes or no. And the man will say, oh, yeah, I wanted this, I want this, and da-da-da. But the female will go, well, no, because I can't do this with it, and I can't do that with it. And I'm the one that's driving it most of the time, and all this kind of thing. So it is, and I don't think they realise that statistic. Whenever I've bought a new car, I've gone to my husband, oh, I like that. And he said, oh, you're the one that's going to be driving it most of the time. The dealership will go, Mr. Swift, what do you think of the vehicle? And will not look at me. So it's that education as well for the gentleman. Yeah, it'd be lovely to have more women in, but the education as well.
But all the advertisement is aimed at men as well, which is so stupid to me. It's such a backwards thing, because when the women are, the majority of decision makers in a family household, why wouldn't we be targeting the advertisement towards women who are driving? Because they are 49% of driving licence holders, and we're most likely to sit and watch an advert, whereas the men do enjoy a review. So I do think that does factor into it. But if we're doing the majority of the driving on a local scale, or even, the younger professionals who are legging it up and down the country every 5 minutes, we want to understand what that driving experience feels like. And we're generally more curious.
So do you want to be sold to by a woman, or do you want to be sold to as a woman?
That's a very good question.
I would rather be sold to as a person. So actually look at me as a person, not a woman, just as a person. And for somebody to come to me and say, what are you looking for? What's important to you? What would you like your vehicle to do? Yeah. And to actually talk to me. And Most ladies will feel comfortable talking to another lady, whereas a gentleman will sometimes come in and they have these preconceptions. Whereas I don't think when a woman is selling, even, me being in business development, I look at the person and I try and find out and solve their issues. Whereas a car dealership, they want to try and get that across the line as quick as possible. And they think, potentially generalizing here, but they potentially feel that, oh, well, if I talk to the man, I'm going to get a bigger, quicker decision, when in actual fact, that's not the case. So long and short of it, no, I want to be spoken to as a person, by a person, ideally a woman. Sorry.
Yeah, my needs as a driver have changed as well. So like my needs and Teresa's needs and Dora's needs will be vastly different. Dora, I do believe you've got very young ones. Teresa's got an older one and some dogs. I don't have any kids. I drive solo quite often. And in the Volvo that I actually did a review on, there was 2 cup holders, but you could push a button. So it just became 1 cup holder and gave you extra room in the cabin, which for me is really cool. There was a place that I could put my handbag. The in-car tech was really intuitive, so I could switch between my music and phone calls really quickly. So I'm, constantly making calls on the go. When you're running your own business or you're working off the road, you need to be able to do that. And we are all on the road anyway. But my needs are vastly different. As if you guys went into a dealership, you would be looking at very different things. So I think Teresa's whole process of, who are you as a person? What would you prioritize as part of your driving experience is really important. I would love to be sold to by a woman because I feel like she would nurture that conversation a little bit more. I don't care about talk. I don't really even care about range as long as it's, above 240 miles, because that's just my need. But no, I don't care how quickly it gets from 0 to 60. I really couldn't care about things like alloys or whatever. It just doesn't bother me. But if I have a conversation with someone who looks like me, is a bit relatable, I'm going to ease into that conversation so much more. But yeah, I think T's point on being sold to as a person.
Yeah, I love that.
What about you, Gary? Who would you rather be sold to by? Yeah, go on. You can't get away from it.
If I could kind of encapsulate everything we've talked about, I've been sold 2 lease vehicles by women. I've been sold 1 second-hand vehicle by EVs, a man. The interactions were very, very similar from my point of view, but I don't know how much of that was related to the individuals knew how to sell to me as a male, rather than it was a woman selling to a man versus a man selling to a man. Every vehicle I've had has turned up on the back of a low loader driven by a man, but I do a lot of test drives. And in a large proportion of the test drives, it's usually a female from the dealership who is sitting next to me. And this is not a slight on females, it's a slight on dealerships. The knowledge at the moment isn't there for me as a man. I will ask the questions about the dealership. I will ask the questions about the car. Often I don't get the answers back that are accurate. But then again, I'm not looking at that and saying, will I be able to fit? Have I got Isofix in the back here for 2 cars? It's because, again, I don't have any kids. I could care less about Isofix in the back. I could care less about whether I could fit 2 dogs in the back because I don't have dogs. But I appreciate that there are people who would have that. The other part to this is I was waiting for a test drive with the Suzuki e-Vitara. I had no idea Suzuki had an electric version. There was a young lady sat there waiting, and I said, "Are you with the dealership?" She says, "Yes, I am." I said, "What are you driving?" And she said, "This car here is my car, the Suzuki e-Vitara." I said, "Oh, fantastic. So you do drive electric?" She said, "Yes." I said, "And what were the problems that you had when you first went to electric?" She said, "Well, it was obviously range anxiety." And I said, "And how did you solve that?" She said, "Well, I live in Brighton. My son's in Plymouth at university. I took the car to Plymouth one weekend."
Nice.
I said, "And had you ever driven long distance and charged in public?" She said, "No." I said, "How was it?" She said, "Not a problem." I turned back up at the dealership with 6 miles on the clock. And everyone went, 6 miles? Wow. But so
I love that this is kind of getting to a point where people are like, it's so boring to talk about. Why do I even have to talk about whether I charge on the road or not even anymore? Because it is a simple process. And that's great.
Absolutely. Cool. Once again, time has sort of caught up with us. So unless there's anything else on that, I think I might like to have a quick session now. So In the UK, and we talked about this already, we do have some of the most expensive public charging prices in Europe. And there are many ways in which these prices can be brought down. We're talking about time of day tariffs, subscriptions, apps, etc. And I've talked about this numerous times on the podcast. But one thing we're starting to see now is the use of third-party advertising on chargers. Some of the more recent designs allow, for example, videos to be displayed as you're charging. Now, in every other medium, advertising is used to decrease the cost you pay for a product. You get Google for free because they advertise to you. Your streaming is cheaper if you opt for the version that serves you ads. Even podcast sponsor ZapMap put advertising in their free version of the app. To remove it, you need to pay for a subscription, but not apparently in public charging. So should we be forced to watch adverts served to us while we charge if we aren't getting any financial benefit for this? And furthermore, what would that financial benefit be? Would it be a reduced price per kilowatt hour? Would it be a free coffee at the nearest Starbucks cost to choose your supplier of choice? Or would it be something else? Who has thoughts on this and like to weigh in?
I'm going to disagree with you straight off the bat, which I didn't think I would, but I will disagree with you. And the reason for, you're not being forced. If you're talking about advertisements on a charge point, right? Okay. You're not being forced. Much like you're not being forced to read what's on the handle of a petrol pump as you put the pump into your vehicle. You know, you don't get pence off of your fuel because they've whacked an advertisement on your petrol pump. I think it's wise for CPOs to take advantage of this advertisement opportunity that is available to them, where they've invested in the larger units like the Siemens or the Alpatronics, you know, where they've got big screens and they're able to do so. I think that's part of the reason why they would spend more for those chargers to have that facility and that additional revenue stream available to them. And I kind of applaud it as a previous business owner. For me, it's like, yeah, why not? Why wouldn't you explore additional revenue opportunities? As a driver, when I'm sat there, if I don't want to look at it, guess what I'm looking at? My mobile phone. Guess who's advertising to me? Everyone. I have been influenced time and time again by the device in my hand. If I don't want to look at it, I look away.
So the counter to that is, if advertising didn't work, they wouldn't do it, right? Therefore, they must be receiving some sort of financial benefit from that. So if they're receiving that financial benefit by the fact that I'm there using their product, why am I not receiving a proportion of that money back in the form of a free coffee or 2 or 3 pence a kilowatt hour reduction?
Do you expect that when you're filling up your car with wet fuel?
How do I know that that's not happening?
Well, you don't get a free coffee if you plug your car or you put your car in to fill it up with diesel. And there's that lovely little advert there. Usually can be Specsavers, I think, are quite a big one that do it, right? You're not getting a free cup of coffee or a discount from Specsavers. Well, there might be a discount code on there from Specsavers. So, you know, but not from the actual service station. Petrol provider.
I feel like on that point, T, you've made such a good point. Where the petrol stations have the advertisements on the handles, that's an additional income stream for that petrol station because it's divvied up between the actual petrol stations. Petrol stations themselves don't make much money at all because they've got to pay for their electricity bill, they've got to pay for the land rental, like their costs are actually huge. What you do get, Gary, as a result of going to a petrol station where they've successfully sold that advertisement revenue on the pump handle is most likely really nice, clean toilet, nice staff, better facilities, and just a better experience if you go into the actual station, right? So my counter argument to you would be, because I know that they do this at Instavolt at the Winchester services, how much more pleasant is your charging experience when you need to pop out and use the facilities, which are lovely, or go in and grab yourself a coffee, which is lovely. Or for me, when I've had the dog with me, Odin, shout out to Odin, he's had access to fresh drinking water and somewhere to use his own doggy facilities. Like, you get what you pay for. If you are being sold to via some advertisement screen, you're most likely going to be at a little bit more of a nicer site.
Dora, you've been remarkably quiet throughout all of this.
Yeah, I'm listening because I haven't thought about it in that much depth before. I guess there's the point about an additional revenue stream, which you made, Kate, which is valid. I think, as I said earlier, we are such an early stage of this sector, of this market. And in the early days, it is providing a service. It's a relatively transactional, buying fuel, hard to differentiate, not the wildest of services, but you've got to get it right and you've got to get the user experience right and you've got to make sure it's reliable and priced accordingly for people to continue to use you and to cover your costs. But I think I'm not going to say whether I sort of had to find it, whether it's a good or bad or what should be the quid pro quo of having to see advertising. I think it's, again, an interesting point at which we've got to where CPOs are starting to look at their estates and say, hang on, I've got something which is valuable above and beyond selling kilowatt hours to drivers. Obviously, that's my core focus. But now I have this big out-of-home advertising estate. What more can I do? When we first looked at ours, when we had slightly larger charges, we ran some campaigns with local artists and artwork, and perhaps we weren't focused enough on the profit at that point. You then get bigger at a greater scale, and you think actually this is an opportunity. And I think it seeing it in isolation is maybe unhelpful because it will be, you get a discount for barriers or friction, right? So some people or some networks will give a discount for whether it's a subscription, like a monthly thing, but also maybe for using an app. So for giving your data, for signing up to something, you get something in return. That's kind of a understood mechanism of the way membership works in this type of world. Similarly, maybe, Gary, your point that if you are forced to watch something, if there's a screen where you have to consume an ad before you get to charge, then you should get some kind of, a discount or something for that. Or maybe in app, if you use the app to charge, but you see something before you charge, there's an element there which I agree with you on. If there's an added barrier, an added friction, and giving data, something like that, the customer, the user should expect something. But I think otherwise, maybe it is just a case of the next step in the sort of slightly more commercialization of this sector, and the retail heads are getting involved rather than the infrastructure heads who will like, let's just build. And then suddenly the retail guys are like, we can operate this like a McDonald's, guys. Let's crack out the advertising. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how it develops. We don't have huge screens, so it's not something we've looked at just yet, but it's absolutely the right kind of thing to be looking at. And it's ultimately, it comes back to how just don't annoy your customers, basically. Can you do it without sending them packing because you've added extra dilution to the brand or friction that they don't want?
And I think what's interesting is you've got to then differentiate between the types of advertising, because I think I was at a charger once not too long ago at a Holiday Inn. Big screen there, you plugged in, and then it's put a thing up saying, you are at the Holiday Inn. Why not head in and grab yourself a coffee? And it's kind of, well, that's sort of advertising, but it's not offering anything free, but it is just sort of giving information.
It was a suggestion.
Helpful.
Yeah, and I'm kind of okay with that. But if it said, for example, do you need a new 3-pin charging cable? Go to evcables.co.uk for a wide range of options. That's a different kind of advertising.
Yeah.
And, if there's a QR code saying, scan here and get a discount on your EV cables, I think that's, from my point of view, acceptable. And I do take your point there about if there's, I did an episode a couple of weeks ago where I talked about the pricing hurdle, which is a hurdle that you have to cross or go over to be able to get a discount. And in your case, Dora, when you were talking about, something comes up on the app and you've got to watch an ad to get to start your charge, and as a result, you get a discount. I think that's a valid pricing hurdle to go over. So I'm not sure whether I've talked myself into or out of my position there.
I guess the other thing to bear in mind is any good marketeer that's, spending thousands and thousands of pounds on a nationwide advertisement campaign on chargers would have a call to action so that they could monitor the success of that campaign. So you're right in that if you were going to go and buy, some cabling and you wanted to scan a QR code, it should take you to a separate landing page for that marketing manager to be able to follow that transaction. So yeah, I think you have talked yourself out of it.
You knew you were going to anyway, I think, Gary, didn't you?
I know. I thought it was a conversation we needed to have, and it's interesting to get at least a CPO point of view on this. And I suspect that what you're saying there, Dora, is something that a lot of other CPOs have had that discussion, whether they've come to the same conclusion as you or whether they've come to a different one. I think that discussion has definitely taken place. Well, I think that's about it. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. It was put together this week with the help of Dora Clarke, Teresa Swift, and Kate Tyrrell. Thank you, ladies, for your time.
The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence. ZapMap is free to download and use with subscription plans for enhanced features such as using ZapMap in car, on CarPlay or Android Auto, and discounted charging across thousands of charge points.
If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. And on the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at EV Musings, where I post short videos and podcast extracts regularly. So why not follow me there? Thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc one. If you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/EVmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/EVmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Now, regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks. So you've gone electric, and so you've gone renewable. First one of those has had a recent update. You'll see it with a bright red image on the front, just like I'm showing on the screen here. Both of those are 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on the Amazon Kindle store. Check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, I know you're probably driving or walking or jogging or in the shower or washing the car, but if you can remember and you enjoyed this episode, drop a review in iTunes, please. Really helps me out. I did go in and have a look recently at some of the most recent reviews. Thank you very much for those who took time to do that for me. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by messaging me at musingsev.bsky.social with the words Charging Nights with a K. Hashtag if you know, nothing else. And thanks, as always, to my co-founder, Simon.
I can see Gary's absolutely chomping at the bit to get involved. He's wriggling around in his seat. He's like, please let me go.
And thank you all for listening. Bye.